Oh, hi! You caught me playing a perfect cover version of the Batman theme song. Speaking of great covers, let's talk about famous comic book cover artist Brian Bolland.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Today I want to talk to you about Brian Bolland, who is primarily known as a terrific cover artist in comic books. But before we can dive too far into what makes him a great cover artist, I wanted to take some time to also discuss the interior work he's done on comic books, especially because there isn't that much of it. Really only 4 or 5 significant contributions to sequential art that he's made. And that's saying something because he's been working in earnest in comic books since 1975. That's a long career. And I want to talk about what is his particular style, what are his techniques, so that we can understand in turn what helps make him a great comic book cover artist. Let's get into it. Brian Bolland is best known as a cover artist. His work is bold and exciting and catches the eye. It sells comics. His work is noted for his thick, inky blacks contrasted with very fine technical detail. He has a photorealistic style, but it isn't stiff. His characters are dynamic and emotive. His compositions stand out with a focus on one big action or one big emotion. His comics frequently employ humor and occasionally a bit of bondage. But before he worked exclusively on covers, he was an artist that enjoyed doing small strips for fanzines. Born in Lincolnshire on the east side of England in 1951, Brian Bolland went to college in 1969 to study art. He studied at Norwich University of the Arts and the Central School of Art and Design. He studied design and art history, but in his own time, he drew comics for fanzines and independent press. In 1972, he met future comic book artist Dave Gibbons at a convention, and they became close friends. After graduating, Gibbons recommended to Bolland that he join art agency Barden Press Features, where he did a few small strips. In 1975, they took on a client named Pickin, who planned on publishing a superhero story called Power Man, intended to be distributed in Nigeria. Bolland illustrated even issues, with Dave Gibbons illustrating the odd-numbered ones. Bolland quickly realized he couldn't illustrate as quickly as Gibbons, and occasionally roped Gibbons and Kevin O'Neill into assisting him on his pages to get them complete in time. So right from the beginning, it was clear that while Brian Bolland had plenty of talent as an illustrator, he was just too much of a perfectionist to keep up with the same tight deadlines that his fellow comic book artists could keep up with. Nevertheless, he was young and hungry, and he loved comics and he enjoyed the work, so he was giving it his all. And it was the next assignment that really got him noticed in a big way. In 1977, Barden introduced Gibbons and Bolland to a new comic book anthology that was about to be published by IPC called 2000 AD, which would focus on science fiction stories. Gibbons joined the book for Program, or Issue 2, while Bolland continued as the sole artist on Power Man. He eventually began contributing to 2000 AD as a cover artist, starting in issue 11 in May of 1977, where he signed his work Bolo. Unlike most comics in America that are published on a monthly schedule, the anthology titled 2000 AD was published on a weekly schedule, and the stories were generally 6 to 8 pages. So what would happen is an artist would illustrate an arc, and then they'd take a break while another artist swapped in, and they'd generally go back and forth. So by the end of 1977, acting editor Nick Landau actually reached out to Brian Bolland and had him fill in for an incomplete story in issue 41. And from that point on, he was rotated into the regular artist schedule on Judge Dredd from 1977 through 1980. While Bolland had not created Judge Dredd, he quickly became one of the most popular artists on the title, thanks to his photorealistic art style that was becoming more and more popular at the time. He helped cement Judge Dredd's square-jawed look. Along the way, Bolland co-created important characters Judge Death and Judge Anderson. Judge Death and his fellow Dark Judges are undead versions of judges from an apocalyptic parallel reality where all life has been declared illegal. Judge Anderson was introduced in the same story. She's a psychic, and Bolland based her appearance off of Blondie lead singer Debbie Harry. In 1983, Nick Landau formed Eagle Comics to publish Judge Dredd stories for an American audience. They gathered several reprinted weekly stories per issue to have a similar page count to normal monthly American comics. They also decided to start the issues with writer John Wagner and artist Brian Bolland's Judge Death story. On top of that, Eagle hired Bolland to create brand new covers for the run. He illustrated the first 10 covers, then came back to do issues 15 through 35, at which point a different publisher began the reprints and used other artists. But after working on his Judge Death story in 1980, Brian Bolland actually moved on from working on British comics in 2000 AD and began working for DC Comics in America. He was actually the first person from England that was hired in what came to be known as the British Invasion, where DC hired a number of talented creators off of titles like 2000 AD. And that movement is primarily recognized for the writers that they brought in, like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. But at the beginning, they started hiring artists, and Brian Bolland was the very first one that they hired. Bolland's first work for DC was a cover on Green Lantern issue 127 from April of 1980. He did a few fill-in issues as well, and editor Julia Schwartz hired Bolland to illustrate covers for Justice League 189 and 190, as well as Superman 422, which Schwartz then had writers develop a story based on the cover. Before those later covers, however, he began work on a big story for DC. In 1982, editor Len Wein hired Bolland to illustrate a 12-issue series by writer Mike W. Barr. This was called Camelot 3000, and imagined King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table being reborn in the far future, fulfilling a prophecy to defend England against outside invaders, which turns out to be aliens. The book was DC's first attempt at a maxi series, or a long-scale limited comic book. It was aimed at the emerging direct market of comic book stores, and was slightly more adult than books submitted through the Comics Code Authority for newsstand distribution. Camelot 3000 is the only time in Brian Bolland's entire career that he aimed to do a monthly title. Everything else he did is either a short story, a one-shot, or cover work. And he actually started things off on the wrong foot, ignoring editor Len Wein's direction to create a cover based on veteran artist Ross Andrews' layout. Bolland had done his own idea, but was rejected and told to do the cover based on Andrews' approved design. He grudgingly fulfilled his assignment, but put the N in his name backwards as a form of protest. He ended up liking how it looked and kept it moving forward. This was the first time someone else would be inking Bolland's work, so he drew very tight, detailed pencils to control the look of the comic as much as possible. For issue 2, DC attempted to work off of just the pencils without inks, but the photography technology available at the time wasn't capable of handling it very well, so only the first 2 pages were created this way. Bolland found some measure of freedom without having to do the inks, and was able to stay with the monthly schedule through the first 7 issues. But he constantly tried to improve his artwork, and slowed down such that issues 8 through 11 were released quarterly instead of monthly. The final issue came out 9 months after the previous issue. Camelot 3000 represents a very cool story, and it's totally worth discussing in and of its own right, but I want to keep the focus today on Brian Bolland's artwork, his techniques, and his history. The interesting thing is when you look at Brian Bolland's interior artwork, his sequential pages, he's more than capable. He's very good at it. And seemingly the only thing that prevents him from doing more of it is he's more than content to simply do covers. Now, a good cover artist can easily command about 10 times the page rate of an interior page. So if you can do 1 or 2 covers a month, you're basically making the same amount of money, at least. So Brian Bolland seems content with that, and the majority of his covers have been through DC Comics, with the occasional attempt to branch out and work with another publisher. Bolland illustrated long runs of covers at DC, including Animal Man, which had a metaphysical angle to it, and paired him with fellow British creator Grant Morrison. He went on to work with him on the covers for his book The Invisibles. By Volume 3 of The Invisibles, Bolland had moved away from working with pen and paper and illustrated everything digitally. He was introduced to the technology by his friend Dave Gibbons, and he made the switch in 1997, and he's never gone back. The line work looks very similar, although he has access to more coloring techniques with his digital expertise. Another lengthy run on DC covers was his work for Wonder Woman during writer William Messner-Loeb's run. During this time, Bolland engaged in one of his few covers outside of DC, creating a cover for She-Hulk issue 14 in 1990. However, the artwork got lost in the mail, so Marvel hired Mark Texiera, an artist with a very different, sketchier style, to make a new version of the cover based on Bolland's initial approved sketch. While Bolland's artwork eventually did show up at the last minute and Marvel published the issue with a wraparound cover, apparently the experience left a sour taste in Bolland's mouth, and he didn't do much other work with Marvel. In the early days of his cover work, and only a couple years after completing Camelot 3000, Bolland released some more interior work, illustrating the 1988 one-shot Batman the Killing Joke with writer Alan Moore. It was actually Bolland who approached Moore with the idea. Bolland went right into it after Camelot 3000, and Moore wrote it right after Watchmen. Both creators had dealt with some delays on what was intended to be a year-long project, so they took their time to get this 64-page story right. The story presents the Joker's origin as a failed stand-up comic who has one terrible day that turns him into the criminally insane man the public knows, although the story is told by the Joker as an unreliable narrator. The backstory is juxtaposed against the Joker in the modern day, torturing Commissioner Gordon with his origin story and crippling Gordon's daughter, Barbara. It was intended to be its own standalone story, but the story's elements, primarily the crippling of the woman who was Batgirl, became canon in the ongoing Batman comics. The artwork in Batman the Killing Joke is gorgeous, just fantastic stuff, and the book justifiably won the Eisner that year for Best Graphic Album. The book itself is incredibly well regarded by critics and fans, and it really does serve as the definitive Joker story. So, with so much love for the book, you'd think everybody is happy with it, but no, one person was not happy with it, Brian Bolland himself, and it was due to the coloring. Fresh off of Watchmen, colorist John Higgins was brought onto the team to help keep up with the deadlines. Bolland instructed Higgins to color the backgrounds in black and white, and the rest of the story in muted November colors. Instead, Higgins used pinks, purples, and an orange tint on the flashbacks. When the book was reissued for its 20th anniversary, the notoriously independent Bolland recolored the book to match his original idea. The only notable interiors Bolland did after The Killing Joke was one of his own stories for the anthology series Batman Black and White. In 1996, Bolland wrote and illustrated the story An Innocent Guy, in which a man with a mundane life outlines his plan to murder Batman as an example of one horrific act by which the rest of his life, by contrast, will be judged as morally good. It's reminiscent of the 1998 Dutch psychological thriller The Vanishing in that regard. Bolland was reportedly inspired to create his story after seeing the cover art for that issue, the final comics work by Alex Toth. Bolland is semi-retired at this point, with his last ongoing project being the covers for Dial H for Hero back in 2012 through 2013. His most recent work was a cover for Detective Comics number 1000 this past month as an exclusive for the British comic store chain Forbidden Planet. Following his story in Batman Black and White, Brian Bolland said he'd only illustrate his own stories moving forward. But since that point, he's really only done cover work. And he really is one of the all-time best cover artists. It requires a different set of skills than sequential work, where you have to tell a story. And in a cover, you're just trying to catch the reader's attention. You're putting your work side by side with dozens of other similar options, and you're trying to make a design that really stands out and pops. There are tons of fantastic comic book illustrators, and of that, a much smaller group of fantastic cover artists. Now, I'm not saying that that makes them better in any way. In fact, they're not utilizing certain skills at all that sequential comic book artists need. But when you think of all-time great cover artists, you might think of people like Will Eisner, maybe Alex Ross, Dave Johnson. There's so many others, so many great artists out there that I would love to hear what some of your favorite cover artists are. But I think certainly when you look at all of them, Brian Bolland definitely has to stand towards the top, if not the top of that pile. That's a nice way to think of it, right? A pile of great artists. Wonderful. Great way to end my analysis. Personally, I absolutely love Brian Bolland's work. There's a book that was published in about 2006 by Image Comics. It is a huge, thick tome that covers his entire career and has a lot of commentary by Bolland himself, as well as a lot of his contemporaries like Dave Gibbons. Fantastic book. I own it. I should have pulled it out for this just to show you, but whatever. I mean, I own it. Wow, great. If I showed it to you, you just go, yep, Chris owns that. But I do recommend it if you like his work and you want to learn about his history and his process in more depth than what I've just been able to provide. I definitely recommend looking for that book. And if you've never read anything by him, just pick up Batman the Killing Joke. That's always kept in reprints by DC Comics. That's a great place to start with his work. There's also a nice compilation of his Judge Dredd work out there at this point. I believe IDW put that out. Anyway, with all that said, let's take a quick look at what fan art came in for the channel this week. First up, Gilberto Hernandez illustrated this portrait of me in what he calls a Robert Liefeld story. Very cool. Thank you, Gilberto. Viewer Grimlock sent in several amazing pieces in the last week, and I'll showcase his most recent here, me as Ghost Rider. Brilliant stuff. Folks, if you'd like to have some artwork featured on this channel, just make sure that it's directly related to comic tropes, and I'm happy to share it. A lot of people love to send in fan art every week, and I do look at all of it in the email, but I'm only able to share the pieces that are directly related to this channel. I would honestly get overwhelmed if I just shared everything. I wish I could, but it would just take way too long. So if you would like to have that featured, just send it into this email address, comictropes@gmail.com. I'll feature it. If you have a link or anything, I'm happy to publish that as well. And then, out of the people that submitted that week, I will choose a winner to get a Gachapon prize that I picked up in Tokyo. We'll get it out of the Gachaponi machine that was donated to us by Lunar Shine Store. So 2 people, so I'm going to flip a coin. Heads will be Gilberto, tails will be Grimlock, and it is heads. Heads. That's a nickel. I don't know if you can see it. Whatever. Gilberto, you win. So let's see what prize you got here real quick. And thank you everybody who has subscribed. By the time this video comes out, it may have crossed 50,000 subscribers, the channel. So that's pretty awesome. Thank you all for making that possible. Pretty exciting. All right, this is, I see a Bandai label there. I see some colorful bits in there. I believe this is some sort of a chibi Gundam figure, like a robot that you'd assemble. So that's cool. I'll get your contact information and send that your way, Gilberto. Also, I just found out that I will be returning to Japan at the very end of this year. I've been intending to do a big episode about Katsuhiro Otomo, specifically his work on Akira. And hey, if I'm going to be in Japan, perfect. I'm going to do that episode there. So you can expect that towards the very end of the year. Very excited that I'll be able to do that. Maybe I'll have to pick up some more Gachapon prizes because we're running pretty low. Just a few more weeks of those. So we'll see. Something to think about. But thank you so much for helping me hit 50,000 subscribers. Means an awful lot to me. Just know that you can continue to support the show by just hitting subscribe, hitting like, sharing it with friends and family. If you want to do more than that, I do have a Patreon where you can just support it on a monthly basis. Depends on what kind of tier you're able to do, but I have them as low as $1 a month. If you want to do just a one-time tip because you've enjoyed a particular episode or something, that's why I've got a coffee account. So appreciate all the support. It really does help. I'd love someday to be able to do this full time. We'll see. Brian Bolland. Pretty awesome that I finally got to review this artist. Somebody that I tremendously admire. Just one of the best, because there's a lot of artists out there that will draw in a hyper-detailed, realistic style, but I don't think all of them have the same energy and emotion that Brian Bolland still puts into his pieces. There's just something so dynamic about them, and he's got a great overall graphic design and layout sense. There's a lot to recommend there. Definitely one of the big names. And it was awesome to be able to see a new piece by him as recently as this past month. So anyway, that's about everything I've got to say this week. I'll see you next time, and until then, keep reading comics. Judge Death and his fellow dark judges are undead virgins.